Good evening. So, I wanted to talk about a couple different things. We're getting ready to have a snowstorm, and today we got quite a bit of rain. So, although it was warmer temperatures, we were going to have wet wind and ground wet conditions. So, I blanketed all my horses for the day to make sure that they stayed. If they laid down, they stayed dry. If they rolled, they stayed dry and clean. If they, you know, didn't want to stand in the shelter and they found themselves out in the rain, they were going to stay dry. And, uh, just out of the wind too. So that's one of the reasons I would blanket. When I choose my blankets, so today ran the risk, if it wasn't wet and windy, ran the risk of them being too hot. One of the golden rules for me is when I'm choosing my blanket and my blanket weight is I do it based on thinking of heat. So if say it was cold enough to think you should put a blanket on, but not so cold that you think you should put a heavier blanket on, and you had to make a decision. Will they be too hot in the heavier blanket, or will they be too cold in the lighter blanket? Which one would I choose? Me, always choose the lesser. They can shiver to create heat with the lesser blanket. If they sweat with the heavier blanket, they're wet from the skin out, and then they can catch chill. Because that's not often a warm wet under that blanket. It's often a cold wet. If you've ever had a horse sweat under a blanket in cold weather, they feel cold to the touch with a wet coat, with a wet fur. They are more likely to get sick from catching chill than they are from utilizing their natural body capabilities to generate heat through shivering. And then they will contain the heat with the lighter blanket versus sweating and not being able to get rid of the heat with the heavier blanket. So I always choose, if I had to lean on lighter or heavier, I would always lean on lighter. Always, always. They came in, it's pretty warm in my barn. It was a warm blanketing decision today because of the conditions. I would not leave my horses standing in the stalls today. This is just a sheet, there's no fill. But I wouldn't leave my horses standing in even sheets if I thought that there was a potential for them to sweat tonight. So I'm going to pull all their sheets for the night, and the temperature's supposed to drop, but they'll maintain, I don't know if you see the insulation, they'll maintain their body heat with each other. Even if the temperatures drop, there's no wind, there's no wet, so they're going to be comfortable without the blankets and possibly hot with them or with the sheets. So I'm going to pull them. So I just wanted to kind of share the reason behind how I do my blankets and how I choose my blankets. Also, I lived in New York, and I never encouraged anybody to buy a heavyweight blanket for a couple reasons. One, because a heavyweight blanket is something that you only really use in single digit weather, and you're not really always in single digit weather. You're usually in teens and 20s. So it's almost like a wasted blanket to buy. So I never go with a heavy blanket. What I do is I layer them. I could layer 2 midweights if I really thought that I was going to be experiencing really bad weather. But generally, if I needed a little bit better than a midweight blanket, I throw the sheet over them. Sometimes I throw the sheet over them just to keep the midweight blanket dry. Speaking of dry, let's say these blankets came in on them wet. Your horse will dry your blanket so much faster on his body than any place you could hang your blanket in your barn. Because often when you hang your blanket in your barn, you have to hang it from a hook, and it buckles up on itself, and it hangs kind of, from floor to ceiling kind of thing. And your blanket's still wet in the morning, and you're throwing a wet blanket back on a horse. A cold, wet blanket back on a horse. So, say these were wet, I would come in later. I would feed them, do whatever I have to do right now, and I'd leave, and then I'd come back, and at night check, I will have a much drier blanket to work with because their body heat will dry your blanket for you. If I had this blanket wet and I hung it, it would not be dry in the morning.